Good afternoon. Last session of the day. Here it's all been going really well, so thank you for stopping by. So as Erin said, I'm Laura from the chemistry group. Sterling, who normally presents with me, is at the back. But as it's International Women's Day, we told him that he had to sit on the sidelines today. So we are from the chemistry group, and I do feel like I should be honest and upfront with you. We're not chemists. We don't really know anything about chemistry. It's a play on words. We just, thank you. My clicker, thank you very much. But yeah, we just didn't want to embarrass Erin and let her know she might have booked us for the wrong gig. So we're just going to make it work. It'll be fine. So welcome. So what we actually are at chemistry is we're a bunch of oxykes and business guys and gals we exist essentially to create opportunities for people to be brilliant at work. And what we mean by that is actually we're kind of experts in predicting people performance. So we work with global organizations to help them to understand and decode what is it that their great people do and how do they find and flood their organizations with more and more of them. So it is a cool job, despite the fact it's not actually chemistry. So chemistry exists because we have this fundamental belief that talent is abundant and it's actually achievement that's scarce. And as organizations, we're doing a really poor job of matching the right people to the right opportunities. And I think there's been some conversation around that this morning, particularly when you're talking about getting more women into leadership roles and into your organizations. We need to be doing it more frequently, and we need to be doing a better job of it. And that's what we're here to do, and it's what we dedicate our working lives to. So today I'm going to talk to you about why we think that's happening, and also talk to you about how we think we can solve it, and give you some examples of actually where we're solving it. And what we'd love to do is open up the discussion. So if you've got questions as we go along, please raise your hand. We want this to be fairly informal, a little bit funny, and but also take away some interesting stats. So we live in a world designed on averages, and I'm going to start by telling you a little bit of a story. Has anyone here read the book The End of Average by Todd Rose? So Todd Rose was a Harvard professor, and he wrote a book called The End of Average. And there's a story that we like to tell to start getting you thinking about this problem. And it's from that book, so I'm quite pleased that no one's read it, because you won't know the answer. So it's the 1940s, and the US Air Force is experiencing an inordinate number of plane crashes. Okay, so it's really quite severe. Actually, in some instances, it's up to 17 plane crashes a day, which is pretty bad for the Air Force. So can anyone guess, and just shout out, can anyone guess what the reason for that might have been? Sorry? Fatigue. No, actually it wasn't. So what was really interesting about the study when researchers looked into this is that actually the pilots themselves weren't necessarily to blame for the reason that the planes were going down. Did someone say mechanical? Okay, so it wasn't actually a mechanical issue. Again, you could understand why you would say that answer, but when they looked at the planes, how they were operating, the technology, the actual quality of the planes and the mechanics were all working fine. So it wasn't to do with that. Right, hold on. Did you just hear? Oh, communication, sorry. No, it wasn't communication. So again, pilots were still able to speak to each other, and the electricity and all of those things were working. They were shot down. No, so even better, these planes were actually not in combat. So these 17 plane crashes that were happening a day were happening just through them flying. Weather? Not the weather. Skills of the pilot? Nope, these guys were really well trained. But so Almost. So actually, it was the pilots that were losing control, but it wasn't down to the capability of the pilot. What was fascinating was actually it was down to the design of the cockpit. Now, the reason for that is in 1926, when they designed these planes, they based the design of a cockpit based on what they described as the average pilot. So they took a number of pilots and measured them against 10 dimensions, created an average, and then designed a cockpit that would then serve that pilot. The challenge with that was that in 1940, when they were experiencing more crashes than ever, they actually looked at a group of 4,063 pilots and measured them against that average. How many do you think fit the average pilot in terms of the size? Take a guess. At least 17 of those. At least. Good answer. So yeah, so how many do you think fit the average pilot? 30%, 40%? It was actually 0. Not one pilot fit against those 10 dimensions, the average, yet they were driving planes that were designed for the average pilot. And one of the things we want to start talking to you about today is that we live in a world designed on averages. It's the easiest and most common thing for us to do when building anything, is it gives us a really good comparison or a really easy thing to compare to. The challenge when you design based on averages, and particularly in this example, is that when you design a cockpit based on an average pilot, actually it doesn't fit anybody. And it's something that we see all the time. That was back in the 1940s, fast forward to 2019, and this is still happening. One of the problems, unfortunately, and a bit of bad news on International Women's Day, ladies, is that we actually live in a world designed for the average man. It's a shame, but it is true. And actually, this is happening in industries and organizations and all walks of life around us. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So, in the UK, in 1997, a British female police officer was stabbed and killed because she removed her stab vest, the very piece of equipment that is meant to keep her safe, when raiding a home during an arrest. And the reason that she removed her stab vest is because the stab vest wasn't designed to fit her body properly. It was extremely uncomfortable and she couldn't do the raid properly, so she removed it. The challenge was she was then unprotected. Fast forward 2 years, another female officer reported to have had breast reduction surgery in order for her stab vest to fit her properly. She actually had her breasts reduced because the stab vest, again, that was designed to protect her, didn't fit her body. It was designed for the average man. Since 1997, there have been 700 complaints from female police officers who have either poorly fitting equipment, have had to go to physiotherapy, or simply believe that they are at risk because of poor fitting stab vests, yet there has been no changes to the design of these vests, and nothing has ultimately been done. So once again, an example of man designing something for the average man that's unsuitable for women, and again, an industry that is full of men and perhaps is now quite unattractive for women wanting to go into it. It's not just happening in the police force. So another example is the automotive industry. So I don't know if you know this, but if you're driving a car and you're a woman, you are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash than a guy. 47%. Not only that, but you're 71% more likely to be moderately injured and then 17% more likely to die than a guy. And the reason for that is all down to the design of a vehicle. So when researchers looked at this, they tested and took into account different height, weight factors of women, but still the answers remain true, which was actually if you're a woman, you are more at risk in a vehicle because it is designed for the average man. But the good news is, actually, in the 1980s, the automotive industry kind of woke up to this and they said we should probably introduce a female crash test dummy, which was good news. So now in the market, female crash test dummies are being used. Can anyone guess, by the way, when America started using the female crash test dummy? It was created in the 1980s. Any guesses? 2000? It's 2011, so 8 years ago. Slightly worrying and a little bit offensive. Also, actually, just so you know, in the last couple of years, they've actually designed a pregnant woman crash test dummy as well, but nobody is using that. It is literally in a box somewhere in a closet, unfortunately. So again, example of man designing for the average base man. I'm going to give you one more example, and then I do promise I'm going to stop man bashing. I'm doing it a little bit tongue-in-cheek to make a point. So finally, let's talk about the tech industry, because I think tech industry is still fairly strong in this illicit assumption that men are kind of be-all and end-all. So in technology, when the smartphone, and in particular when Apple released their health tracker back in 2014, there was much fanfare around it. They were extremely excited. And what they boasted was it can track your steps, you can track your blood pressure, it can even track your blood alcohol levels, which was great. I mean, everyone was super excited by it. There was one critical detail that Apple missed. It kind of comes in handy for women once a month. It's a period tracker. And you get apps for these things now, by the way. But Apple missed it off in their development. By the way, they have since added it on. I think women made enough noise about it at the time. But not only that, Apple also introduced Siri, which was a super exciting development for the iPhone. And interestingly, when they first introduced Siri, there were a number of design faults that were designed based for the average man. So, for example, you could ask Siri, and Siri would tell you where a local strip bar was, or where you could go and buy Viagra. Siri knew the answer to that. If you wanted to know where perhaps an abortion clinic was, or you told Siri you'd been sexually assaulted, Siri didn't understand. And so my point around this, once again, is that we have these design features and flaws that are designed by the average man, or by men for the average man, and it's completely and utterly narrowing and excluding women. So why is that happening? And chemistry come at this from a talent perspective, and our answer to this will be, well, actually, if you look at these industries and these organizations, they're largely male-dominated. And so the challenge with that is, well, of course they are. You've got organizations filled with men, thinking like men, designing products for men. So what's the most simplest answer, or most obvious answer, do you think, to solving these male-dominated industries? What would you say that is? Hire more women. Yeah, get more women in. Excellent. And we would agree. The challenge is what we're hearing time and time again, particularly, and let's take the tech industry, and in particular STEM, for example, is that, well, not enough women are interested in these roles. That's the problem. The challenge is the data says that that's categorically not true. So if we take STEM, for example, the evidence suggests that in 2018 to 19, it was projected that there were around 8.65 million STEM jobs. What they found was, I think it was actually around 3.92 million young women were graduating graduating with STEM degrees in 2018. So actually, we're adding 4 million, roughly, young women to the talent pool every year. We're adding them in. But what we're finding is that less than 25% of women are in those roles. So that tells us two things, really. One is that they're either not getting invited to the table, they're not getting invited into these roles, or when they get there, they're leaving. And the problem with that is that it's one thing to say, okay, we need to get more women into these organizations, but the challenge is the organizations still aren't solving the problem that we're not creating an environment that is inclusive of women. We know we need to fix it, and we want to get more women in the door, but actually we're not making it an attractive place for them to be. Going back to the police officer example, like, how do you hire more police officers if you can't even design an environment that makes them feel safe and makes them feel valued? And that's a real challenge. You know, I think Sterling describes it as, it's one thing inviting someone to the party, but you've got to be invited to dance. Is that it? That was your chance. That was your chance. There you go. Sorry, Sterling. So why is this happening? Well, we would put this down to, and our research over the last 15 years tells us that part of the reason we're not changing the environment is that we're not changing the lens in which we view talent. And what we mean by that is that in the last 15 years, our research suggests that most organizations are still over-rotating on previous experience and academic achievement as being the mostly used ways of predicting future performance. So most organizations in their recruitment process will say the school you went to or the university you went to and where you've worked before are what we use to filter and make a decision on whether you're going to be a good fit for our organizations. The challenge with that is two things. One is that they're really unreliable predictors of whether someone will be a good fit for your organization. It's not that they're not important, and particularly in these fields, we would argue that there's some table stakes stuff in there. It's not that they're not important, but they're really reliable predictors of fit and of performance. The second thing with that, and the challenge is when you look at, for example, previous experience as a predictor of success, when you're working in a male-dominated industry, you're not broadening your talent pool, you're narrowing it. So if you want to change the environment, don't go to another organization and take all of the people from that one, because if it's a male-dominated bro culture, you're just going to pluck them from somewhere else and put them into your organization. Okay? So what we would say is you need to look at more data, broaden the data set of what you're assessing when you're hiring talent, and that problem will fix itself. And we'll talk about how you do that in a minute. But by the way, Google, so more and more organizations are starting to open their eyes to this and recognize that it's not simply degree and experience. Google, a couple of years ago, actually did a study with 10,000 of their people, and they found that previous experience and the school you went to were actually poor predictors of performance. It's something that we've recognized as well. Take a little bit of an issue with using Google as a good example, purely because actually, whilst Google do get this theoretically and talk about diversity being a big thing, women and minority groups are still hugely underrepresented at Google. And actually, in 2018, towards the end of last year, it was found Google were asked to align diversity to their board's performance, and the board said that they weren't going to be held responsible for it, which kind of conveys this view that you're not confident that you can effectively hire and retain women in the organisation, which isn't really putting your money where your mouth is it? Which, let's be honest, is Google. They've got tons of it. They should be. So look, I think they're on the right track, but perhaps some of the biggest organisations still aren't really getting this right. Well, the good news is there are some really good examples of organisations out there that are doing this. And one that we like is Etsy. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Etsy. It's a marketplace organisation. So Etsy in 2011 were looking to scale their business. And one of the things they wanted to do was heavily invest in the product and heavily invest in their technology. And the challenge they had when they looked at what was stopping them was that they needed to understand more about their consumer and design for the consumer. The challenge with that was that they found that 80% of their consumers were women. But of the 47 engineers that worked within Etsy, only 3 of them were women. So 96% of their engineering talent were men, designing a product for a consumer that was 80% women. Which kind of goes back to the stab vest story. So they recognised that that's a problem. So diversity became critical to their product, which was critical to their performance. And when you look at how they addressed that problem, for Etsy, it wasn't, well, we shouldn't just go out and hire women with tech degrees and engineering degrees or who have that experience, because A, these guys are already in those roles today and they're not looking for work. B, they're not going to want to come and work here because culturally, the team's very male dominated and it's not attractive for these people to come in. So what Etsy actually did was they ended up re-engineering the recruitment process, but also instead of hiring experienced engineering talent, they looked past the degree and experience and hired for potential. So they invested in younger talent who had the right fit to their organisation and essentially gave them the training and the development to develop them further up the line and into the organisation. And as a result, they grew their female engineering talent by 500% in 1 year. Etsy still win awards for the best place to work, and they still have some of the most impressive diversity statistics in the industry, purely because they look at what are the traits that we need in order to be successful, and they look past the CV and degree, but also think about it as we need to find the right people for the right role in the organisation, not necessarily just we need to find experienced female engineering talent. So that's all well and good, and Etsy are a great example of that, and we appreciate that they could potentially be perceived as a bit of a unicorn in this space. So actually, how do you do this? Like, what's the answer? How do you create more organisations like Etsy that are giving more and more women the opportunity to be brilliant at work? Well, there's a really simple process, and what we do at Chemistry is we see human beings through 5 boxes. So the first thing that we would say to any organisation that's looking to increase the number of women is, first of all, stop just going out and looking for women. First of all, understand what are the traits that drive performance in your organisation. Okay? what are the things that your high performers are doing today, regardless of whether they're women or men? What are the things that they're doing? And replicate that. And it's really important not to just look at what's the experience these people have, but actually we look at things that are much harder to change and therefore give us much more of an accurate view as to whether they're actually going to perform in a role or not. So what I mean by that is, as you can see here, this is our chemistry's 5-box model. It sits at the core of everything we do at chemistry. And it, as I said, it sees human beings through 5 boxes. So at the bottom, you've got skills and experience. And it's at the bottom not because it's the least important. It's at the bottom because it's the easiest to change. Okay, essentially, skills and experience are things that we can get fairly easily. I'm not saying that certain degrees are in any way easy to obtain. However, they are things that are easy to change. If you want to get more accurate in understanding whether a human being is right for your organisation, then you need to measure the things that are much harder to change and the things that sit more further up the 5-box model. Having this discussion in the last session because we gave the example of we see intellect in 2 ways. You have either cheers, knowledge that you've built up over time, versus fluid intellect, which is being able to cope with new and ambiguous and complex information and do so at speed. So it's the difference between an agile software developer who has a high degree of fluid intellect, so they can take in, process and retain new information and they're constantly working with new data, versus someone like in a specialist role such as a lawyer, or someone suggested earlier, or even a doctor. Now, the reason it's really important that we don't assume that intellect is just important for everybody is because actually for a lawyer, you would want to measure someone who's got high crystallized intellect, and you wouldn't want to put them through an assessment for fluid intellect. I'll give you a really good example of this, and I use the example of my mum. So my mum is someone who, she's a solicitor, and when my mum's in the courtroom, she's been doing it since she was 16, when my mum's in the courtroom or she's talking to me about legal stuff, she appears to talk, think, and process information at speed, really fast. Take my mum out of that context and give her WhatsApp and tell her to voice note me, and it's incredibly difficult to get her to be able to work it. And I use that example tongue-in-cheek, by the way. She knows I tell that story. But the reason that's really important is because if being able to process information at speed outside of the context of being a lawyer was important for her role, my mum wouldn't be good at it. But it's not. What my mum is great at is being able to process information that she's accrued over time. And so her ability to think broadly and to process information at speed is contextual to her being a lawyer. And the reason we say this is important is because often we find, with many organisations we work with, that people will often say, well, we need people who are bright, so we need some form of intellect assessment put in the process. It happens with graduate schemes all the time. So many graduate schemes will assess for someone's cognitive ability without really understanding whether that cognitive, at the speed at which you process and retain information, actually has any correlation to job performance. And it's normally because there's a bias that someone said, yeah, but I want someone who's bright. And we're like, well, why? Why is that? So it's really important that we understand these things and we test them and we don't make any assumptions around actually, if we say bright, what do we really mean by that? And is it a case that you want someone who's got this fluid, crystallized intellect, or does it sit somewhere else? And 9 times out of 10, it sits somewhere else. So what are the other things? Well, you've got here, the next one down is personality. And personality at chemistry is the innate characteristics that shape you at work. So many of you may have gone through a personality assessment before. Personality is really important because it helps us understand what someone values in the workplace. The challenge is when you measure personality in isolation, and a lot of organisations have started to do this now, they will go out to, they'll say, okay, we know it's not about degree and experience, so we should start measuring people's personality traits. The challenge is when you look at that in isolation, it can be quite limiting. So good example of this, does anyone here describe themselves as an extrovert? Yeah, I am. Sterling, hand up. Okay, so the people who describe themselves as an extrovert, would you say you're an extrovert all the time? No, me neither. And the reason that, therefore, that information can be potentially limiting is if you were to take a personality assessment and you had a benchmark for extroversion and that said that you perhaps scored below that benchmark, actually it hasn't taken into account that sometimes you might appear as an extrovert, but in other situations you might appear as someone who's a lot less more introverted. And that's why at chemistry we would look at intellect and personality through the lens of the next one down, which is motivation. And motivation is all about your working environment. It's the things that you're energized by. And so, for example, whilst I score high on the extroversion scale, I'm actually quite motivated by working environments where I can work on my own. I don't like to spend time in an open plan office with lots of people around me if I want to get work done, whilst it's fun. If I want to get my work done, I actually prefer to work at home. And so as a result, what that affects is how I behave in that environment. I might appear extroverted in some instances, but actually I come across as quite different in others. And so it's really, really important to understand, based on my role and the organisation that I work in, what are the traits that will enable me to perform, or what are the traits that will predict performance, and aligning these things up to that, because these are the stuff that's much more difficult to change. If we measure this stuff up front in a recruitment process, it gives us much more of a deeper understanding of how someone's likely to behave and their likely fit for a role up front before we've even met with them. The last two in this are behaviours and experience. The difference between behaviours and experience being that behaviours is what I will do. So my behaviour is what I will do. It's my natural default. When the pressure gets under me at work, it's the thing that you see. Versus experience is what I know how to do. And I gave an example of this earlier. We were having a discussion around chemistry and my career. So at chemistry, when I first joined, I worked in our project management team and then in our consulting team for another 8 years. And whilst I absolutely loved it, one of the things that were critical or defined as critical to chemistry, to performance as a consultant, was something we call planning and organisation, right? So you had to pull together project plans, you had to manage those project plans. And so in order to be successful, when we defined our own what great looks like, because we try and drink our own champagne, we identified the behaviour of planning and organisation as being really critical. The challenge is that it's something that I know how to do, but when the pressure gets on me, it's the first thing that goes out the window. And what's really fascinating about that is you can tell that if you were to hire me based on that profile, you would have been able to spot and identify further up the process that that's something that's not natural to me. So, in my personality traits, I'm more of a big picture thinker. I'm not motivated, I don't value detail at all. I'm also really low conformist, so I hate process and rules. To the point that if there's a rule put in place, I'll probably try and break it intentionally. In my motivations, I'm something you call high self-starting. So I enjoy a working environment where I can just like get going and kind of run off with something. Some would call it gung-ho. I would call it energy. But what that means is all of those things mean that my approach to planning an organization is surrounding other people around me and getting them to help me organize and run that so that I can take a step back and do something else, rather than I'm sitting there actively managing project plans and looking at the risks and organizing other people's lives. You would not want me to do that based on those details, because I would mess something up, and I have done in the past. So it's really important, and going back to that story, I think it's really important that, first of all, when we're looking at talent in our organizations, first of all, we start out by understanding what are the behaviors that are going to be important for a given role. Okay, regardless of the degree and experience, what are the behaviors that are going to be important within a given role? And then what we can do is we can decode the type of individual that's going to deliver that behavior or that output that you're looking for. What I would also say is that you have to think about these things with the context, within the context of your organization. So at Chemistry, with every client we work with, no two clients have the same profile. No two roles have the same profile. You could be a software engineer at Facebook, and you would look completely different to a software engineer at Google. The reason for that is they do have different culture, they have different leadership, they have different processes. Yet if you apply this view that because you're a software engineer and you've worked at Google, you could work at Facebook, actually you potentially might be missing something and not take into account the context of the role and the context of the culture and how those things might be different. So Chemistry will always start with you're unique, so design it to your context. What we know is that if you measure all 5 of these things, you can be up to 85% accurate in predicting whether someone will perform in a given role or not. And by the way, when you look at experience and academic achievement in isolation, you're looking at only really being 25% accurate. Our studies have shown that those things are really only 25% accurate in predicting future performance, which we'd like to change, and we do with our clients. So the great thing about this, by the way, is that when you start to add more objective data into your hiring process, the diversity problem fixes itself, because what you're not doing is saying, okay, well, we want more women and we want more women with degrees and experience. That's actually narrowing the talent pool. By focusing on the traits that are important for the role and thinking about who's the right person for this role versus who's the right woman or who's the right man, you're broadening out the talent pool, and I promise you the diversity fixes itself. So we've got a really good example of this. Chemistry worked with a global technology organization. So these guys are big, very well known. And they came to us, their head of sales came to us because they had 2 problems. One was they weren't achieving their sales targets, so they were behind, which he wanted to try and fix. The second thing was that they had been given some pretty ambitious, as he described it, diversity targets that their HR were driving. And they were really struggling to hit them. They were doing about 20%. So what we do is we do this audit where we go in and we look at, okay, what is your process looking for today? What do you believe are the things that predict performance? And then using our model, we go back in and test it. So we put people through these assessments. And what these look like, by the way, are intellect, personality, and motivations are like online assessments. And then behaviours and experience we assess through an interview. So we do. We're quite different to Gallup in that ours are highly customised to the context of the organisation rather than being a standard. So going back to the challenge we talked about earlier, when you look at averages, a lot of those assessments are designed based on an average salesperson, so and an industry average. And as we've seen, that's really dangerous when you do that. It can limit your potential because it's comparing you to someone else in an organisation that might look nothing like yours. But in terms of the experience, you're right. So it's roughly a 20 to 25 minute online psychometric that will ask you to rate whether you like something or whether you are motivated by this and strongly agree to strongly disagree. So what we found in this instance was we asked them, okay, what is it that the process is looking for today? What we found was that they were hiring, or they believed that success was hiring from the top 8 academic institutions. So we have like a top 8. This was in the UK, this work. And they wanted to hire from the top 8 universities. And when you asked them why that was, they said, oh, well, you know, we need people to be bright. And bright people come from these universities. The second thing that they said was, we need people who are highly assertive. And in the workshop, this genuinely happened. When we asked about assertiveness, someone said, see, this is why we hire guys. Because men are just naturally more assertive. We need men in these roles, and that's why they're successful. So, I mean, we challenged that a little bit. But the other thing we did say was, okay, why is assertiveness important? And they felt that assertiveness meant that men knew where to go, they knew the direction they needed to go within the organisations, they could make decisions, and they could influence. Okay. And the final thing was extrovert. So they wanted people who they believed were highly extrovert because actually it was sales. You need to be able to build a relationship, and you need to be able to, therefore you need to want to be open and connect with your client and take them out to dinner. And you can't be introvert in that environment. We're like, okay. So we take their high and low performers and we put them through our assessment. And actually what we found was almost the opposite to be true. So the degree and academic institution were inconsequential to performance. Okay, so actually there was no correlation as to whether the education you had or the previous experience you had was had any link to whether you were going to perform in the role. Yet up front, they were essentially narrowing their talent pool by taking talent from only those institutions. So that was the first thing. The second thing was what they described is when they described they wanted assertiveness, people who could take control, make decisions, actually what we found was that high performers were collaborators. So they knew how to bring people together and build a consensus. And actually this kind of command and conquer was actually something that low performers were doing. And then finally, they wanted challenges. And we think this probably linked back to their belief or this bias that we need people who are highly assertive. But actually, what this was about was they needed people who could come to the client and instead of taking them out to dinner and building a relationship and you being mates, actually what they did was they built a relationship with them that was around knowledge sharing and coming to them and challenging their thinking and giving them something new to think about and therefore changing their opinion and building their relationship that way. So again, we had this bias that was looking at talent in a different way based on data that was irrelevant to predicting human performance. We then actually found out and decoded what that needed to look like for the organisation. And the result was truly quite significant. So they now hire from 401 universities instead of the 8. So they've immediately broadened their talent pool just from that first piece of insight. The second thing was that they increased their sales target attainment by 35% in the first year, much to the head of sales delight. And the thing that we're the most proud of was we saw gender diversity jump from 20% to 52% in the first 18 months, which, when you consider this was a problem they'd been tackling for 3 years, and they had this culture to begin with and an attitude that was very male-dominated, they immediately, within 18 months, managed to change that and achieve 52%, which is something the organisation hadn't done before. So our point, and I'll wrap this up, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. But I think the thing that we really wanted to leave you with was, first of all, if you change the data, you can change the outcome. So if you just change how you're measuring these things, diversity will solve itself. And this piece around the fact that talent is abundant, we're just doing a really poor job of matching the right people to the right opportunities. But we don't have to be. It's not a really difficult thing for us to change. Yes, there's some science. It's not quite rocket science. But actually, if we can just decode and start with what are the traits that will make someone successful in our organisation and start there and measure those, we can start to see changes in the environment and hire more women and better talent into our organisation as well, overall. So one of the things Sterling and I wanted to leave you with today and something to take away and think about is just how this might manifest itself in your organisations. I know that health and life sciences, in terms of some of those percentages I shared up front, I think you guys are probably leading the way in that industry, and it's a growing community of women. But we would argue it's still not enough. And there is a way that we can fix it. We just need to change the way that we're looking at the problem. But I think that's it. That's it from me. So thank you very much. Has anyone got any questions at all?
How do you measure intellect in a job interview? I know you gave examples of just the crystallize is not always a good predictor of the job role, but is there a quick way you can
So we don't measure intellect in an interview. You would measure it before the interview. You can measure it online using an assessment. They're anywhere between 18 minutes to 90, depending on the one that you choose. But typically, you would measure it up front. And the reason you would do that is because it is hard to change. If you find, when you're decoding what great talent looks like for your organisation, that intellect is a predictor of success, you'd probably want to send that to someone earlier on in the recruitment process, because if they don't hit the benchmark or they're far away from the benchmark and you know that that's critical to their performance, then you wouldn't put your highly paid hiring managers and take them out of their jobs to go and spend time interviewing someone that isn't going to be able to change that.
Are people actually doing that? Testing intellect before?
Typically, when you would test intellect, you would probably have an initial interview with them first, like a 30 minutes. But yes, I mean, we work with a gas and power trading company in the UK, and intellect for them is extremely important. So they actually measure personality and motivations at the same time. They send everything to the candidate first. Yeah, they do all of that online, and then if they fit or they are a good fit, that's when they meet them. If not, they go back to them and say, we've done a piece of work to understand what great looks like for our organisation, and unfortunately, you don't fit. What they do, and what we always recommend, is that we give reports to people. So they get an automated report and we give them feedback, because that's typically why you wouldn't do that if you weren't willing to give someone feedback. Any other questions? Awesome. Sure. We were just having that discussion, weren't we? Yeah. So it's definitely harder with a smaller business because obviously what we're talking about is you can do a scientific study with a population of a lot more people that you have to compare it to. So in a smaller organization, you'll probably have less performers, high performers to role model against. The recommendation, and this isn't a science recommendation or a legal recommendation, but what we would advise is that you could say, okay, who are my high performers? Who would I rehire? If there were no consequence, who would I fire and rehire, if you like? And the ones that you would rehire, okay, what is it about them that means I would rehire them? And then get them to take an assessment. And that would help you understand, okay, so that thing I love that so-and-so does, actually, this is where we can see it in the data. And so what I'd want is more people that look like that. The challenge you have with that when you start to scale is that what you don't want to do is keep hiring the same person over and over again, which is where the decoding and what great looks like piece comes in, that we come in and do. And the context becomes really important. But certainly for a smaller organization, that's how I'd think about it. Cool. Well, I've got 1 minute until we're out of time. So thank you everyone for coming in and for listening to me today and to us. If you've got any questions or anything comes up, then please do grab us. But if not, have a great weekend. Thanks very much.